"Stop the signing. Your signature has been forged," the black girl said, and the entire boardroom froze in a silence so deep it felt like the air itself had been cut off. The words hung above the polished mahogany table of Harrington Capital like a warning no one had expected to hear inside a glass tower overlooking downtown Chicago. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the city skyline. But inside the room, every movement stopped at once. A pen hovered mid-air in the hand of William Harrington, billionaire known for closing billion-dollar deals without hesitation, his eyes narrowing as he slowly turned toward the voice that had interrupted everything. Standing near the entrance was Maya Carter, a small black girl no older than 8, her backpack slightly oversized, her expression steady in a way that did not match her age. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a ripple of uneasy laughter broke from one of the executives seated along the table, followed by a whisper that this must be some kind of mistake, a child who wandered in from the wrong floor. Daniel Cross, the visiting investor with a polished smile and tailored suit, leaned back slightly, his expression calm but sharp, studying the girl like an inconvenience rather than a threat. William lowered the pen slowly, his gaze still locked on Maya. "Who let her in here?" someone muttered, but Maya did not step back. She stepped forward instead, placing a small tablet on the edge of the table with both hands, the screen already unlocked, glowing faintly in the tension-filled room. Claire Bennett, Harrington's senior legal counsel, frowned and leaned slightly to get a better look, her instincts shifting as she noticed the file name displayed on the screen. "Contract under signature and for analysis _ final." Maya's voice did not shake as she repeated it, quieter now but sharper, like she was trying to make sure only the right person heard it. "He didn't sign that document. That signature was copied." Daniel let out a short laugh, controlled and rehearsed, shaking his head as if amused by an absurd misunderstanding. "This is ridiculous," he said smoothly. "We're discussing a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure acquisition, not playground stories." A few executives nodded instinctively, relieved to dismiss the interruption, but William did not move. His eyes dropped to the tablet, then back to Daniel, then briefly to Maya again. Something in her certainty did not match the noise around her. Outside the glass walls, helicopters circled the skyline, distant and indifferent, while inside the room the atmosphere shifted from confidence to fracture. Maya tapped the screen once, and a comparison overlay appeared, 2 signatures side by side, one stored in Harrington's official database, the other embedded in the signed contract on the table. The differences were subtle but undeniable: pressure variance, stroke delay, and microstutter points only visible under forensic enlargement. Claire's expression tightened as she leaned closer. Daniel's smile held, but something in his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. William's fingers slowly left the pen entirely. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly, not looking away from the screen. Maya answered without hesitation. "I saw him print it. Not sign it. Print it." A heavier silence followed, one that no one in the room seemed prepared to carry. Daniel exhaled through his nose, adjusting his cufflinks as he leaned forward. "A child's interpretation of legal documents is not evidence," he said, voice smooth, but the edge beneath it was beginning to show. Maya did not react to him. Instead, she turned the tablet slightly toward William, revealing a second file. Security access logs from Harrington Capital's internal signing system. Timestamped entries showing unauthorized digital signature replication during a 7-minute window the previous evening. Claire straightened immediately, her professional composure tightening into alert focus. William's eyes narrowed further, the weight of the information settling in. The room, once prepared for celebration, now felt like it was balancing on a line no one had noticed before. Daniel shifted in his seat, the first visible sign of discomfort breaking through his polished control. "This is internal data manipulation," he said quickly. "Someone planted this." Maya finally looked directly at him. "Then explain why your login ID accessed the signature vault at 11:42 p.m. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. No one spoke. Even the executives who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact with each other. William slowly leaned back, exhaling once, as if recalibrating the entire moment in his mind. Then, without raising his voice, he placed his hand flat on the table. "Stop the signing process," he said. The words were simple, but they landed like a shut-down command across the entire room. One of the assistants immediately moved toward the control panel, halting the digital contract projection that had been seconds away from final execution. The massive screen behind them froze mid-display, the forged signature locked in place like evidence suspended in time. Daniel's expression shifted for the first time, a flicker of irritation breaking through the surface of his confidence. He stood slightly, as if to regain control of the room through presence alone. "William, this is a misunderstanding escalating unnecessarily," he said, but William did not look at him. His attention was still on Maya, who stood quietly by the table, her hands now resting at her sides, as if she had already done what she came to do. Outside, the city continued moving, unaware of the decision that had just changed the trajectory of $1 billion agreement. Inside, nothing would proceed the same way again. The silence in the boardroom did not break immediately after the signing process was halted. Instead, it settled into something heavier, as if the air itself was now holding its breath. William Harrington remained standing at the head of the long glass table, his eyes fixed on the frozen contract projection still glowing faintly on the screen behind them. Executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unsure whether to speak or wait. Daniel Cross slowly adjusted his posture, attempting to reclaim the calm image he had entered the room with, but his eyes kept flicking toward Maya Carter, who still stood near the table edge, quiet and steady, her small hands now resting against the strap of her backpack. Claire Bennett leaned closer to William and lowered her voice. "We need to verify the system logs immediately," she said carefully, her tone controlled but urgent. William nodded once without taking his eyes off the situation in front of him. "Do it," he replied. Maya did not move. She was watching Daniel now, not with fear, but with a calm focus that made the room feel even more unsettled. Daniel forced a small smile, stepping slightly away from the table as if distance alone could reset control. "This is becoming unnecessarily dramatic," he said. "A child misinterpreting technical data should not be slowing down a deal of this magnitude." No one responded immediately. Claire was already opening her tablet, pulling internal access records from Harrington Capital's secured network. The screen flickered as encrypted logs began to load. Maya finally spoke again, her voice quiet but precise. "He used an access window that was supposed to be inactive. Someone reactivated admin permissions for 7 minutes last night." William turned slightly toward her. "How do you know the timing?" Maya glanced at the tablet she had brought, then back to him. "Because the system timestamps every signature injection attempt. It does not lie even when people do." A faint tension rippled across the room at her words. One of the senior executives leaned toward another and whispered something under his breath, but the words were lost in the growing focus around the table. Claire's expression changed subtly as she scrolled further. "William," she said after a moment, "she is correct. There is a temporary elevation of privileges tied to an internal account." Daniel exhaled slowly, a controlled sound that still carried frustration. "This is internal noise," he insisted. "System anomalies happen all the time in enterprise environments. It does not mean fraud." William raised a hand slightly, not aggressively, but enough to stop further argument. His attention was no longer divided. It was narrowing. He looked at Maya again. "Show me exactly what you saw," he said. Maya stepped forward and tapped the tablet once more. The screen shifted to a playback interface, displaying a time-stamped sequence of file interactions. Lines of code and access. Logs appeared in structured order, showing a precise moment when the digital signature was inserted into the contract file. The interface highlighted a user identity tied to Daniel Cross's corporate credentials. A murmur passed through the room, quickly suppressed as everyone tried to process what they were seeing. Daniel's expression tightened for the first time. "That is not possible," he said quickly. "Those credentials are protected at multiple levels. No external party could replicate that access path." Maya looked up at him. "Then why does the system show your device fingerprint?" The question landed without volume, but with weight. William stepped closer to the screen, studying the details himself now. The data was consistent, structured, and time-stamped in a way that aligned too cleanly to dismiss outright. Claire moved beside him, her eyes scanning rapidly as she cross-referenced internal authentication records. "The fingerprint matches a registered executive device," she confirmed quietly. Daniel turned slightly toward the room now, trying to regain authority through tone. You are all allowing this to spiral based on unverified interpretation, he said. I have built partnerships across this industry for over a decade. Do you really believe a child walked into a secured executive floor and decoded proprietary signature systems better than your own legal and technical teams? The room was silent again, but this time it was different. It was no longer dismissive silence. It was uncertain silence. William's gaze remained steady. No one is questioning your history, he said slowly. We are questioning the data in front of us. Daniel's jaw tightened. For a brief moment, his composure slipped just enough to reveal pressure beneath it. Claire continued scrolling through the logs, then paused. There is another layer here, she said. The signature replication was not just inserted. It was masked through an internal proxy route, which means someone intentionally routed it to appear as if it came from a routine authorization process. William turned toward her fully now. Can you trace it? Claire hesitated. Not in real time. It would require a full system. Audit rollback. Maya stepped closer again, her voice still calm. You do not need a rollback. The system already flagged the origin server. It is in the backup chain. Claire looked at her for a brief second, surprised by the precision, then nodded slowly. She is right, she admitted. Daniel took one step backward, almost imperceptibly. The room noticed. William noticed. But no one spoke yet. Outside the glass, the city continued moving as if nothing had changed. Inside, every person now understood that the deal was no longer the center of attention. The truth was, and it was already unfolding one layer at a time. The atmosphere inside the executive boardroom had shifted from controlled authority to structured uncertainty, as if every person present was now carefully measuring their words before speaking. The digital contract projection remained frozen on the large screen, still displaying the halted transaction that had been seconds away from completion. William Harrington stood near the center of the room, no longer focused on the deal itself, but on the chain of evidence unfolding in real time. Claire Bennett continued working through the internal system logs, her fingers moving with increasing speed as more authentication layers became visible. Maya Carter remained close to the table, quiet again, her eyes tracking every reaction in the room rather than the screens themselves. Daniel Cross had not spoken for several seconds. That silence was no longer confident. It was controlled. He slowly moved one step toward the side of the room, as if trying to reposition himself away from the center of attention without drawing notice. William's voice finally broke through the tension. Continue the trace, he said to Claire. Claire nodded and opened a deeper diagnostic layer within the system. The screen shifted to a network map showing internal routing pathways of the signature process. Multiple nodes lit up across the corporate infrastructure, revealing the exact sequence of data movement that had led to the forged signature being embedded into the contract file. Maya stepped closer again and pointed at one of the highlighted nodes. That is the entry point, she said calmly. Claire zoomed in, confirming the timestamp and origin server. This is an internal authentication relay, she said quietly. It should not have been accessible from an external device at that time. William's expression tightened slightly as he absorbed the implication. Daniel exhaled slowly, then spoke with a more restrained tone. You are all looking at system complexity and assuming intent, he said. That is not how enterprise infrastructure works. There are redundancies, overlaps, automated failovers. Maya turned her head toward him. Her voice remained steady. Automated systems do not rewrite approval signatures. The room fell quiet again. One of the executives lowered his gaze to the table, no longer willing to meet anyone's eyes directly. Another adjusted his chair, visibly uncomfortable. Claire continued analyzing the logs, then paused again as a second layer of verification data appeared. There is a manual override signature embedded here, she said. It bypassed standard multi-factor authentication. William turned slightly toward her. Who authorized it? Claire hesitated for a moment before responding. The system attributes it to the same credential set tied to Daniel Cross. A low, almost imperceptible shift moved through the room. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Daniel immediately responded, his tone sharpening. That is incorrect attribution, he said firmly. Credential spoofing is possible if someone has enough time and access to replicate behavioral patterns. William looked at him directly now. It was the first time his full attention had locked onto Daniel since the start of the meeting. "Are you suggesting someone inside my company fabricated system logs to implicate you?" he asked. Daniel nodded quickly. "Yes, that is exactly what I am suggesting." Maya remained still, observing rather than intervening. Claire continued scrolling, then stopped again. Her expression changed slightly, not with shock, but with confirmation. "William," she said slowly, "there is something else." William did not look away from Daniel. "Speak." Claire turned the screen toward him. The signature was not only inserted, it was validated. Through a secondary approval chain that originates from a legacy administrative account that was deactivated 6 months ago. William frowned slightly. Why would a deactivated account be active in any capacity? Claire's answer came carefully. It would not be, unless someone reactivated it manually through backdoor privileges. Daniel took another step back, this time more noticeable. The shift in his posture was subtle, but no longer controlled. Maya's voice broke the tension again, soft but precise. "That account has a pattern history," she said. Claire looked at her. "What do you mean?" Maya pointed to a sequence on the screen. "It only activates during high-value contract processing windows." The implication landed fully this time. The room did not react loudly. It reacted in stillness. William slowly walked closer to the display, studying the timeline himself. Every layer Claire revealed aligned too cleanly, too deliberately, as if the system had been shaped rather than randomly compromised. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice no longer carried the same balance. "This is becoming a misinterpretation of technical anomalies," he said. "We are losing focus on the actual deal." William did not respond immediately. Instead, he pressed a small intercom button on the table. "Security audit team to the executive floor," he said calmly. The message was simple, but it changed the energy of the room instantly. Daniel turned his head sharply. "William, this is unnecessary escalation," he said. William finally turned toward him fully. "No," he said quietly. "This is verification." Maya stepped back slightly, her role in the room now complete, but still central to everything unfolding. The tablet she had brought remained on the table, its screen still open, still displaying the sequence that had started the entire chain of exposure. Outside the glass walls, the skyline of Chicago continued unchanged, indifferent to the disruption inside the tower. But inside the room, every decision from this moment forward had already shifted direction. The system was no longer being trusted. It was being questioned at every level. The executive floor of Harrington Capital had entered a new state of controlled alert, where every movement was measured and every silence felt intentional. Security personnel from the Internal Audit Division arrived within minutes, moving through the glass corridor with quiet professionalism before taking position near the entrance of the boardroom. No one spoke unnecessarily. The presence of the audit team alone confirmed that the situation had escalated beyond a standard contract review. Inside the room, William Harrington remained standing, his attention divided between the frozen contract display and the unfolding verification process on Claire Bennett's tablet. Maya Carter stood slightly behind the main table now, her presence no longer interrupting but still shaping the direction of every conversation. Daniel Cross had not sat back down. He remained near the side of the room, maintaining distance from both the table and the screen, as if repositioning himself could restore balance to the situation. Claire continued scrolling through deeper system logs now, pulled directly from the authentication core. The data streams were dense, but consistent, each layer reinforcing the same conclusion that the signature had not been legitimately executed through standard approval channels. William finally spoke again, his voice lower than before. "Show me the full authorization chain," he said. Claire nodded and expanded the visualization. The screen shifted into a multi-layered sequence of access points, each node revealing a step in the contract signing process. At the center was a highlighted entry labeled Administrative Override Protocol Active. Maya stepped forward slightly and pointed again. "That is where it changed," she said. Claire leaned closer, verifying the timestamp. "This override was triggered at 11:42 p.m., she confirmed. Daniel immediately responded, his tone tightening. "That timestamp is irrelevant without context," he said. "System processes run background tasks all the time. You are isolating fragments and building assumptions." William turned his head slightly toward him. "Then provide context," he said simply. Daniel paused for a fraction of a second, then straightened his posture. The context is that this company operates on distributed authorization architecture. Any number of automated systems can simulate signature validation under load balancing conditions. Claire did not look at him as she spoke. This was not load balancing, she said. This was direct credential injection into a finalized contract file. A quiet tension moved through the room again. One of the audit security officers stepped forward slightly, but remained silent, waiting for instruction. William raised a hand slightly, signaling them to hold position. Maya remained still, watching Daniel now with quiet focus. Daniel exhaled slowly, then shifted his tone again, attempting to regain composure. William, he said, you are allowing external emotional influence to interfere with a high-value acquisition decision. His eyes briefly flicked toward Maya when he said it. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the center of the table, his gaze never leaving the data on the screen. Emotional influence is not what we are dealing with, he said finally. We are dealing with unauthorized system access inside my company. Claire added another layer to the analysis. There is something unusual in the routing path, she said. William turned back toward her. Explain. Claire pointed at a branching node in the system map. This pathway does not originate from external intrusion. It originates from within the executive network cluster. A subtle shift occurred in the room. Even the security personnel adjusted their stance slightly, recognizing the implication. Daniel's expression tightened. That is impossible without multi-level internal compromise, he said quickly. And there has been no breach reported. Claire looked up at him now. There has been no reported breach because the system classified it as authorized activity, she replied. Maya stepped forward again, her voice calm but precise. It was not classified as a breach because it was signed off using a dormant administrative profile, she said. Claire nodded slowly. That profile was previously deactivated due to compliance restructuring. William's gaze sharpened. Who had access to reactivate it? Claire hesitated briefly. Only 3 executive-level accounts retained legacy override privileges after restructuring. A pause followed, heavy and controlled. William's voice dropped slightly. List them. Claire began to respond, but before she could complete the answer, Daniel interrupted. This is becoming a directed implication rather than an objective audit, he said. You are narrowing variables to fit a predetermined conclusion. William turned fully toward him now. The room grew quieter as his focus locked in. Are you denying that your credentials were used in the signature process? He asked directly. Daniel held his ground. I am denying any unauthorized action tied to me personally, he said. Maya watched him closely, then spoke again. Then explain why your credential fingerprint matches the override access log at the exact activation window. The room went still again. Claire looked between both of them, then back at the data. The confirmation was already there, structured in multiple redundant layers of verification. Daniel's composure began to fracture slightly at the edges, not in volume, but in control. That data can be manipulated, he said, but his tone was no longer as steady as before. William stepped closer to the table again, placing both hands lightly on its surface. That is what we are here to determine, he said. He then turned slightly toward the security team. Begin full internal audit lockdown protocol, he instructed. The officers immediately acknowledged and moved to secure communication channels outside the room. Daniel took a step forward. William, this is unnecessary escalation, he said again, but his voice now carried a different weight. William looked at him for a long moment before responding. No, he said quietly. It is containment. Maya slowly stepped back toward the edge of the room again, no longer speaking, her role having shifted entirely from interruption to catalyst. The contract screen behind them remained frozen, the halted agreement now symbolizing something far larger than a single transaction. Inside the glass walls of the executive floor, the structure of authority was no longer centered on the deal. It was centered on the truth being extracted from the system itself. The lockdown protocol on the executive floor had shifted the entire environment of Harrington Capital into a controlled verification state, where every system channel, every access point, and every active credential was now under continuous audit. The glass walls of the boardroom reflected a room that no longer felt like a place for decision-making, but instead like a space for confirmation of truth. Security personnel stood at measured intervals near the entrances, maintaining silent control over movement without interfering in the ongoing internal review. William Harrington remained at the center of the room, no longer focused on leadership posture, but on the unfolding structure of evidence displayed across multiple screens. Claire Bennett continued to work through the expanded audit layers, now accessing deeper administrative logs that required executive clearance verification. Maya Carter stood slightly apart from the main table, her posture calm, her attention no longer on any single screen, but on the reactions of the people around her. Daniel Cross had not spoken in several minutes. His position near the side of the room remained unchanged, but the confidence he had entered with was no longer visible in his posture. Claire paused as a new data layer finished loading. The system displayed a consolidated authentication map linking every step of the disputed signature process. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she analyzed the final confirmation sequence. "William," she said quietly, "the system has completed full trace verification." William turned toward her, and Claire hesitated only briefly before responding. The override originated from within a verified executive access channel tied to legacy administrative permissions. A stillness followed the statement. It was not dramatic. It was precise. William slowly stepped closer to the screen, studying the final confirmation chain. Every node, every timestamp, every credential path converged into a single consistent origin point that matched an internal executive profile. Daniel finally broke his silence. "That conclusion is incorrect," he said firmly. "You are interpreting correlation as causation. Internal systems can be spoofed if sufficient access parameters are compromised." William turned slightly toward him. "Then explain why every independent audit layer converges on the same credential origin," he said. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Because the system is being forced to align data under audit pressure," he replied. Maya stepped forward again, not interrupting aggressively, but with calm precision. "The system does not change under audit pressure," she said. "It reveals what was already recorded." Claire looked at Maya briefly, then back at the data. "She is correct," she confirmed. "Audit mode only exposes hidden pathways. It does not modify them." Daniel exhaled slowly, then attempted to reframe his position. "Even if that is accurate," he said, "it still does not prove intent. Systems can generate false attribution through cascading authentication errors." Williams studied him for a long moment, then spoke in a lower tone. "Intent is not what we are verifying right now," he said. "We are verifying access origin." Claire continued scrolling through the final authentication breakdown. The display shifted to a single highlighted line showing the exact moment the signature override was executed. The timestamp aligned with internal executive access credentials. The system flagged the entry as verified and unaltered. Maya looked at the screen and then spoke softly. "That is the moment it happened," she said. No one responded immediately. The weight of confirmation in the room was no longer theoretical. It was structured, documented, and independently verified across multiple layers of system integrity. Daniel took a small step backward, his breathing measured but no longer fully controlled. "William," he said again, "you are making a decision based on incomplete contextual framing." William turned fully toward him. "No," he said quietly. "I am making a decision based on verified system output." A pause followed that statement. It was not filled with movement or sound, only recognition. Claire closed one final diagnostic layer, signaling the completion of the audit cycle. "There is no discrepancy remaining in the authentication chain," she said. "Every layer confirms the same origin point." William nodded once, slowly. Then he turned toward the security personnel stationed near the entrance. "Secure all executive access credentials associated with this transaction," he said. The officers acknowledged and immediately moved to execute the instruction through encrypted internal channels. Daniel's expression shifted again, now showing a controlled attempt to maintain composure. "This is an overreach," he said. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the frozen contract display still projected on the screen. The document that had been seconds away from final execution now sat suspended in a state of irreversible suspension. "This deal is no longer active," William said finally. The words were calm, but absolute. A faint reaction moved through the room as executives processed what had just been confirmed. Claire stepped back slightly from the console, allowing the system to complete its final audit closure sequence. Maya remained still, her presence quiet but unchanged, as if the outcome had already been decided the moment she spoke. Daniel looked across the room once, not at William, not at Claire, but briefly at the tablet still resting on the table where Maya had placed it earlier. There was no visible confrontation, only recognition that the structure he had been operating within was no longer stable. William's voice lowered slightly as he gave the final instruction. "Begin full legal review and notify Compliance Enforcement Division," he said. The security team acknowledged immediately. The room did not erupt. It did not need to. Everything had already shifted. The boardroom of Harrington Capital remained still, but the system beneath it had already moved into irreversible correction mode, where every decision, every credential, and every action tied to the halted transaction would now be examined at its source. The legal review directive had transformed the executive floor of Harrington Capital into a fully controlled compliance environment, where every digital action related to the halted transaction was now being duplicated, recorded, and forwarded into secured audit channels. The glass walls of the boardroom reflected not a meeting in progress, but a system-wide correction event unfolding in real time. Security personnel remained stationed at key points, while internal compliance officers coordinated with external regulatory interfaces through encrypted communication links. William Harrington stood near the center of the room, his attention no longer divided between decision-making and observation, but fully committed to the consequences now emerging from the system itself. Claire Bennett continued working at the central console, now focused on compiling the finalized integrity report that would be submitted to corporate governance oversight. Maya Carter remained near the edge of the table, quiet and observant, her role no longer active in the analysis, but still central to the origin of the entire sequence of events. Daniel Cross had been moved slightly away from the main cluster of executives, under discreet supervision by internal security protocol, while still present in the room as the review process continued. Claire paused as the final verification layer completed its aggregation cycle. The screen displayed a consolidated report titled Authentication Integrity Confirmation Complete. She reviewed it carefully before speaking. "William," she said, "the system has finalized the full audit report. It confirms unauthorized override activity originating from an executive-level credential with direct access to contract execution privileges." William nodded once, absorbing the confirmation without interruption. "And the contract itself?" he asked. Claire responded without hesitation. "It has been permanently suspended pending regulatory investigation." A quiet shift moved through the room as that confirmation settled. The transaction that had once represented a multi-billion-dollar expansion initiative was now formally inactive under compliance enforcement status. Daniel spoke for the first time since the audit confirmation began. His voice was controlled but noticeably restrained. "This will be reviewed at the corporate board level," he said. "And when it is, procedural. Inconsistencies in this audit process will be questioned." William turned slightly toward him. "That is expected," he replied calmly. Maya looked up briefly at William, then back toward the table. Claire continued reviewing the final data streams, ensuring all logs had been properly sealed and time-stamped for external review. The system now showed a full chronological reconstruction of every action tied to the forged signature event, from initial unauthorized access to final execution attempt. William stepped closer to the screen. The visual reconstruction displayed a sequence of internal system movements, each one labeled with precise timestamps and credential identifiers. There was no ambiguity remaining in the structure of the data. Claire spoke again, her tone more measured now that the technical process had reached completion. "All evidence packets have been duplicated to external compliance storage," she said. "Regulatory authorities will receive full transparency access within standard reporting windows." William nodded slightly. "Good," he said. Daniel shifted his stance slightly, maintaining composure but no longer attempting to challenge the system output directly. Instead, he addressed William in a lower tone. "I want the record to reflect that I deny any intentional misconduct," he said. William looked at him briefly. "The record will reflect exactly what the system has verified," he replied. Maya remained still, watching the exchange without intervention. The environment around them had now fully transitioned from active investigation to formal resolution processing. Internal compliance officers began collecting digital confirmation signatures from all present executive systems, ensuring chain of custody integrity for every file involved in the audit. Claire finalized the submission package and secured it within encrypted corporate vault storage. The contract projection on the screen had been replaced by a compliance status summary indicating irreversible termination of the transaction. William turned away from the screen and looked across the room. His gaze briefly passed over Maya, acknowledging her presence in a way that carried recognition. Beyond the immediate situation, he then addressed the room as a whole. This company operates on trust built through verified systems, he said. When those systems are compromised, correction is not optional. No one responded verbally, but the acknowledgement was implicit in the stillness of the room. Daniel was guided toward the exit corridor under standard internal procedure for active compliance review subjects, not with force, but with controlled administrative protocol. Claire closed her console and stepped back, signaling the completion of her role in the audit process. Maya slowly adjusted her backpack strap and remained in place for a moment longer, observing the final state of the room. The executive floor of Harrington Capital had returned to stillness, but it was no longer the stillness of uncertainty. It was the stillness that follows irreversible confirmation, where systems have spoken clearly and every remaining action belongs only to documentation and consequence. The executive floor of Harrington Capital had settled into a controlled aftermath state, where the intensity of the compliance action had transitioned into structured documentation and finalized system reporting. Every terminal on the floor now displayed synchronized audit summaries, each one reflecting the same conclusion. Unauthorized executive credential misuse had triggered a full transaction suspension and regulatory escalation. The glass walls of the boardroom no longer felt like a pressure chamber, but rather like a transparent record of events already sealed into corporate history. William Harrington stood near the center of the room, no longer observing technical data, but processing the broader implications of what had occurred. Claire Bennett remained at the main console, finalizing the last integrity verification logs before secure transmission to external regulatory authorities. Maya Carter stood slightly apart from the table, her small frame still, her attention now no longer on systems or screens, but on the shifting atmosphere of the room around her. Daniel Cross had already been escorted into a separate, holding area under internal compliance supervision protocols, leaving an absence that was now impossible to ignore in the space he had previously occupied. Claire closed the final report window and turned slightly toward William. "The compliance package has been transmitted," she said. "All supporting logs, access trails, and authentication records are now locked in external regulatory storage." William nodded once, acknowledging the completion without additional instruction. "And internal systems?" he asked. Claire responded calmly. "All related credentials have been suspended pending full enterprise-wide security review." A quiet pause followed as the significance of the statement settled across the room. The transaction that had once represented a major expansion initiative was no longer simply halted. It was now permanently embedded in a regulatory investigation framework that would extend far beyond the executive floor. William slowly turned his attention toward Maya. For a moment, he did not speak. His gaze was measured, not analytical, but reflective. Maya remained still, waiting without expectation. Finally, William spoke. "You were correct," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight that shifted the tone of the room more than any technical report had. Maya did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked briefly toward the table where the contract had once been displayed, now replaced by compliance summaries and audit confirmations. "It was in the system," she said quietly. Claire, standing nearby, looked at her with a subtle expression of acknowledgement. "Not everyone sees what is already there," Claire added. William took a slow breath, then stepped away from the center of the room, moving toward the large glass window that overlooked the Chicago skyline. The city continued its normal rhythm below, unaware of the corporate disruption that had just unfolded above it. The contrast between external normalcy and internal correction was stark. Behind him, the audit team began closing down temporary monitoring stations, confirming that all investigative protocols had transitioned into long-term review status. Claire gathered her tablet and prepared to leave the room after final confirmation handoff. Maya adjusted her backpack strap slightly and remained where she was for a moment longer. William turned back toward the room. This company will undergo a full security restructuring, he said. What happened here cannot be allowed to exist in silence within our systems again. No one responded verbally, but the acknowledgement was present in the stillness. Claire gave a slight nod and moved toward the exit corridor, followed by the remaining compliance personnel. Maya began to walk slowly toward the same direction, her steps unhurried, as if the urgency of the previous hours no longer applied to her. William watched for a moment before speaking again. "Wait," he said. Maya stopped and turned slightly. William walked back toward her. The room was now nearly empty except for them. He paused briefly, then spoke in a lower tone. "You did not just stop a transaction," he said. "You forced this system to reveal itself." Maya looked at him without saying anything. William continued. "Most people inside these buildings spend their entire careers learning how to operate within systems they never question. You saw through it without hesitation." There was no immediate response. Maya simply held his gaze for a moment before shifting her eyes slightly toward the glass wall beside them. William studied her quietly, then added, "What made you notice it?" Maya answered after a short pause. "It did not look right," she said. William nodded slowly, as if accepting that simplicity carried its own kind of precision. Claire reappeared briefly at the doorway, signaling that final system lockout procedures were complete. William gave a slight gesture of acknowledgement, and she left again. The room returned to near silence. Maya finally turned fully toward the exit. William did not stop her again. As she walked away, the executive floor of Harrington Capital remained still, its systems now stabilized under reinforced compliance structures, its records sealed under external regulatory oversight, and its leadership left facing a truth that could no longer be contained within any internal narrative or assumption. The executive floor of Harrington Capital had entered a final stabilization phase, where all active compliance systems were now fully synchronized with external regulatory databases and internal audit archives. The urgency of the previous hours had dissolved into a controlled silence, replaced by procedural confirmation processes that ran across multiple secured terminals. Every screen in the boardroom displayed identical status lines indicating that the investigation had been formally closed at the operational level and escalated into permanent oversight review. William Harrington stood near the glass wall overlooking downtown Chicago, his reflection faint against the skyline, his posture no longer focused on immediate decision-making but on long-term consequence. Claire Bennett remained at the central workstation, completing final archival encryption of all case files before transmission confirmation to external authorities. Maya Carter was no longer in the main boardroom space, having already exited through the executive corridor moments earlier, leaving behind a presence that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of everything that had occurred. Daniel Cross remained absent from the room, fully transitioned into formal compliance custody processing under standard corporate governance protocol, where internal investigation would continue outside executive observation. Claire closed the final system interface and turned toward William. "All audit records are now permanently sealed under regulatory encryption," she said. "There will be no internal modification access from this point forward." William nodded slightly, absorbing the finality of the statement. The room itself felt different now, not because of what had been removed, but because of what had been exposed. The structure of trust within the system had been rewritten through verification rather than assumption. William slowly turned away from the window and walked back toward the center of the room. Claire gathered her remaining devices and prepared to leave. Before exiting, she paused briefly. "Regulatory authorities will likely request direct executive testimony within the next compliance cycle," she said. William acknowledged without hesitation. "I will be ready," he replied. Claire gave a slight nod and exited the room. The boardroom doors closed behind her with a soft mechanical seal, leaving William alone for the first time since the audit began. He stood in silence for several seconds, looking at the table where the contract had once been displayed. The surface was now empty, reflecting only ambient light from the city beyond the glass. The absence of the transaction felt more significant than its presence had ever been. He moved slowly toward the chair at the head of the table, but did not sit. Instead, He placed one hand lightly on the surface, as if acknowledging the space where control had once been absolute. His mind returned briefly to the sequence of events, not as a failure of systems, but as a disruption of certainty. The assumption that internal safeguards were sufficient had been proven incomplete. Outside, the city continued its steady motion, traffic moving along intersecting lines far below the tower. Inside, everything had shifted into a different kind of stability, one defined not by confidence, but by verification. After a long pause, William spoke quietly to himself. It did not break the system, he said. It revealed its limits. He remained still for a moment longer, then slowly straightened and stepped away from the table. As he moved toward the exit corridor, the boardroom lights dimmed slightly, entering automated standby mode now that all active processes had been completed. The glass walls reflected an empty room where decisions had once carried immediate weight, now replaced by documentation and review cycles. In the quiet corridor outside, the building's executive level returned to normal operational rhythm. Assistants moved between offices, security personnel resumed standard stationing, and system dashboards displayed stable corporate metrics once again. Yet beneath that surface stability, a full structural audit remained active, ensuring that every layer of the incident would continue to be examined without interruption or influence. The moment had passed, but its impact remained embedded within the architecture of the company itself, permanently recorded, permanently verified, and permanently impossible to ignore. The executive level of Harrington Capital had fully transitioned into a post-incident operational state, where all systems related to the compromised contract were now locked under permanent compliance oversight and continuous audit monitoring. The glass tower overlooking Chicago had returned to its usual rhythm of corporate activity, but within its internal governance structure, a lasting trace of the event remained embedded across every verification layer and security protocol. William Harrington stood alone in his private office now, separated from the boardroom and the formal audit environment, his focus no longer on procedural execution but on reflection. The events of the day had been recorded in full within the company's governance archive, accessible only through restricted executive clearance and external regulatory authorization. Claire Bennett had already submitted her final executive summary and left the building under standard end-of-cycle protocol. Daniel Cross remained under formal investigation processing, with all corporate privileges suspended pending external legal review. Maya Carter had left the executive floor earlier without ceremony, moving through the building's lower levels and exiting into the city, her presence no longer visible within corporate systems, but permanently recorded within the audit narrative as the initiating source of system exposure. William slowly walked toward the large window of his office, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The city appeared unchanged, continuing its steady movement of vehicles, lights, and distant activity, unaware of the internal disruption that had reshaped one of its most powerful corporate structures. Yet within Harrington Capital, nothing remained entirely the same. The integrity systems that once operated in passive verification mode had now been permanently upgraded to active continuous validation, ensuring that no single credential or override could function without multi-layer confirmation across independent channels. William placed both hands behind his back as he stood in silence. His thoughts returned briefly to the sequence of events, not as isolated incidents, but as a structured revelation of assumptions that had once gone unquestioned. The system had not failed in a traditional sense. It had operated exactly as designed, until a previously unaccounted variable had exposed its blind spots. That variable had not been technological in nature. It had been observational, a simple recognition that something did not align with expected structure. The system had responded only after that recognition had been introduced. A soft notification appeared on his desk console indicating that external regulatory confirmation of case closure review initiation had been received. William acknowledged it without hesitation. The matter was no longer internal. It now existed within a broader legal and compliance framework that extended beyond corporate control. He turned slightly away from the window and moved back toward his desk, where a single sealed folder remained labeled Executive Incident Summary. He opened it briefly, scanning the final compiled report. Every detail was precise, every system log verified, every timeline reconstructed without deviation. At the center of the documentation was the confirmation that unauthorized executive credential usage had directly triggered contract manipulation attempts, resulting in immediate suspension and regulatory escalation. William closed the folder and placed it back on the desk. There was no further action required within the company regarding resolution, only adaptation. A quiet knock came at the office door. One of the senior compliance advisors entered briefly, confirming that all departments had returned to standard operational stability and that no residual system anomalies remained active. William listened, then gave a single nod of acknowledgement. The advisor left, and the office returned to silence. William remained seated for a moment, then spoke quietly to himself. "Systems do not protect against what they are not designed to see," he said. The words remained in the stillness of the room without response. He looked once more at the skyline beyond the glass. Somewhere within the structure of his company, changes were already being implemented that would alter how every future transaction, credential, and approval process would be validated. The event had ended, but its influence had extended beyond resolution into redesign. Not as disruption, but as correction. Not as failure, but as exposure. The city outside continued unchanged, but within Harrington Capital, a new standard had already begun to form, built not on assumption, but on verification at every level.